So thank you, Melinda, and I should extend my gratitude also to our colleagues at our MIT for inviting me here, for getting me on this 28 hours long flight journey that I've perfectly recovered from by now. So can you hear me? Yeah? So I'm afraid that I've gotten myself into a fairly complicated matter here. When Melinda invited me to hold this lecture, I decided to seize the opportunity to put down on paper the thoughts that have occupied my mind and my body during the past year or so. So I proposed a paper on death, or rather, on the life-death continuum, and its nexus with the world of images and photography in particular. Yet that was really a strategy from my side in order to push myself to get these thoughts out of my head and out of my desk. And now I wonder whether I really got to a stage to make this public at all. But of course it's too late to change my mind, so I'll just go ahead. So thank you, Melinda. Thank you all actually for giving me this opportunity to collect these reflections and to share them with you. My hope is really that I learn about what I'm trying to get at here by sharing it with you. So it has been a real challenge, and I've been walking on a very thin line between self-reflexivity and proper auto-referentiality. And I'm still writing and thinking as I'm speaking to you right now. So this is, of course, a very open-ended piece. I have many questions to raise and few answers to give. But perhaps after all, this is in a way the duty of a critical social scientist today. That is, to keep raising new and old questions, refining the spectrums of things to explore, going beyond the taken for granted rather than attempting to come with some answers. I have decided to take on board Michael Tausig's invitation of trying to delve in estrangement. That is, of avoiding to reduce what is strange and new to us to what we think we already know. I quote, "When we explain the unknown, we reduce it too quickly to a glued piece of paper. We reduce it too quickly to the known," says Tausig. I have merged this approach also with philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti's invitation to avoid fixating meaning, to unleash observation and perception from an overarching desire to explain. Following his advice, I'm trying to observe my process of dealing with death in silence, that is, away from the conditionings of our knowledge, of our consolidated narratives and our past experiences. So this paper could also be considered a detour, a side road of discovery, to use Paul Toller's terms, a necessary, unavoidable process that was triggered off during the weeks I spent in a hospital in northern Italy, caring for my dying father. My iPhone with its camera and sound recorder, my notepad, a life-logging camera, and later on my Sony Alpha 7, have been my companions during this painful yet sublime journey. I took to them first for communicating with my father's medical staff. Photos and videos were precious in filling up the gaps of attention of the nurses and assistants of the hospital. Later on, these tools became my own allies for closing the gap with my father's own experiences, for entering his world, and for accompanying him towards his death. At the end of this path, during August 2015, I suddenly found myself left alone in the company of things dead, from where the title, and I have a double reference here because Melinda and I are both working on that title, in the company of, from two different angles, which I find very beautiful. So I was in an empty house filled with dead objects. I entered this new world on the top of my toes, and I discovered that it offered me very few evident links to the past or to the future. It rather glued me into the present. And in this present, photographs and photography became my companions, providing me with an open passage to the realm of the dead. I hope I can get through this without crying, because I mean this is at moments quite difficult for me to speak about this still. So an autoethnography of grief, of mourning. This paper is perhaps an exercise in what Dewey called negative capability. That is, a form of immediate, sensuous, and poetic reasoning, whose primary nature is responsive, spontaneous, instinctive. This is perhaps the exercise of a fool, ignited, paraphrasing William Blake, by the hope that if he persists in his folly, he may eventually become wise. There are some core assumptions behind this paper. The first one is that I share the view of Benjamin, Nietzsche, and many others that modern capitalist countries have a fundamental incapacity to deal with death. the apotheosis of unproductivity, death has been excluded from our lives. The apotheosis from our lives. Yet, in line with Nietzsche, we must interrogate ourselves about the extent to which the dead are really no longer among us. The distinction between life and death is the pillar upon which the distinction between self and other, me and things, is built. We must therefore fill the gap between them in order to be able to fill the gap between ourselves and the world we live in. So rather than looking upon death as a definitive end of a path, we can address it, following Robert Hertz, as a temporary exclusion from human society. This is indeed the insight that we get if we look at the meaning of death in many other cultures of the world. Buddhism and Hinduism, for instance, foreground the idea that life is a long, slow, and painful preparation towards death. So death is really a constitutive part of life. And this insight, I suggest, is probably becoming more and more relevant today in a world facing one of the largest ever systemic crises, very visible particularly in Europe. With unemployment rates rising, social welfare declining, etc., less and less people are in a condition today to pay for medical care, for private hospices, etc. So after centuries of exclusion, death may slowly climb its way back into our present, making itself visible in our public and private lives again. The second assumption on which this paper builds is that photographs are, among other objects, pivotal in helping us keeping a connection with the realm of the dead. This assumption builds on the work of many scholars on the connection between death and photography. It builds on Bazin's insight that photographs are a modern tool for embalming time. On Roland Barthes' idea that the photograph has, and I quote, the power to open a punctum to the realm of the dead, or John Burge's idea that the photograph is a memento from a life being lived. Pushing these ideas further, I suggest, however, that photographs are not only documents portraying life and death, but they are passages, tools for connecting the living with the dead, for closing, to use Freud, a circuitous path to death. Finally, and connected to the both, I believe that while offering indeed a link to the world of the dead, photography, and more broadly probably image making, can also be looked upon as a tool capable of generating life. Photography is a way of being in the world, of entering a dialectic with the reality that surrounds us. A tool for being in the present, photography constitutes a way to open up our perception to the various layers of the human experience, teaching us in particular also exactly how to die. So I will start my presentation with a brief introduction on the connection between photography and death, probably boring for those of you who are visual scholars, maybe not for the others. I will then proceed to discuss the idea that photographs of the dead are not mere representation of dead people, but active ways for us to incorporate dead people into our lives. So the pictures of dead people that we adorn our houses with can be addressed as ways to which we let the dead look at us, touch us, talk to us. I will then proceed to discuss the extent to which making photographs, rather than just an act of killing, we use the term shooting for pictures, and of handling out the past to the future, can be interpreted as a way for opening up time, for living in and tasting the present. So the first section, the first theoretical set of reflections will be about photographs as objects, the second part is photography as a practice, basically. So, let me remove my jacket. And let me see if this one works. That's me as a little boy. Modern lives begin, of course, with photographs, and they also end with photographs. That's not me, but that's my great-great-great-grandfather, who's strikingly similar to me. The level of being scary. So since the invention of photography, we have learned to celebrate the second moment in particular, death, with the help of photographs, impressing with the help of light and hopefully, for eternity, the image of the deceased on the surface of a material, a metal plate, piece of paper, a screen. An act of redemption, as John Berger called it. Photographs are a way for saving something or someone from being abandoned and forgotten. Death has been undoubtedly a key metaphor for how we have learned to approach photography. So look at these iconic quotes. Suzanne Sontag, to take a photograph is to participate in another person's or thing's mortality, vulnerability, mutability. Precisely by slicing this moment and freezing it, all photographs testify to time's relentless melt. Mirzov, to take a photograph is to participate in another person's people are so wonderful that a photographer has only to wait for that breathless moment to capture what he wants on film, and when that split second of time is gone, it's dead and can never be brought back. So common to these quotes is a terminology making the act of, I use the term making rather than taking a photograph, an act of violence, an aggression, kind of a negation also. Slicing, freezing, taking, relentless, breathless, capture are the terms adopted here. And these terms do indeed function as natural companions of more conventional words such as, again, shooting and framing, which are also imbibed with a kind of belligerent spirit. But indeed, the connection between photography and death is also strictly an empirical fact. It reflects the way through which early photographers approached the new medium. As we all know, the daguerreotype proved immediately to be a valuable substitute for the cumbersome and expensive production of death masks. You know, the medieval of the Renaissance masks. The obsession with death went on famously with Nadar's pictures of the catacombs and cemeteries of Paris. And perhaps, even though this at the more metaphorical level, perhaps with Aget's portraits of the empty streets of Europe, of Antwerp, Paris. You know, Aget was portraying cities without people, without human life. So the early years of photography witnessed also to the growing interest for using the camera as a tool to prove the existence of ghosts. And we have here one PhD, Carrie, just I had the pleasure to evaluate exactly on that topic. It's a largely unstudied phenomenon. Then later on, the camera moved to the battlefield. Roger Fenton brought the viewers to the War of Crimea, showing the aftermath of the battles that costed several hundred human lives. Felice Beato famously did the same in India, documenting the consequences of the revolt as the sepoys, the Indian soldiers at the service of the Raj, the British Empire. Due to the cumbersome apparatus that photography required at the time, there was only a before and an after of the battle, and no during. But with the invention of lightweight cameras, the Leica 35mm among others, photography entered the heart of the battle, showing us not only the consequences of war, but its actual unfolding. Well known are Robert Capa's photographs that mark the extent to which the act, and here I quote Suzanne Sontag again, of taking a photograph ceased to be a ritual and became a reflex, taking the name of the technology. So starting from the mid-1930s, photographs of wars, killings, famine, mass migrations, and other critical events started filling up the pages of newspapers, to the extent that, as Suzanne Sontag pointed out, being a spectator of calamities taking place in another country is a quintessential modern experience. This connection goes on until today, and indeed we have become accustomed to see such images, to such an extent that we no longer react with shock to them. This was anticipated long ago by Sontag, when she said that suffering in relation to such images flares up, is shared by many people, and then suddenly fades from view. What Sontag, though, to some extent misses out here is the fact that such images always portray very distant worlds, the world of the other, and seldom our own world. This is from the photographs of Don McCullin to the photographs of Sebastián Salgado. We seem to get very easily moved by members of our communities dying, and hence we keep them out of the pages of the newspapers, we cover them with blankets on the television, etc. But if they die elsewhere, or are other kind of people, then we may display them. This is the case, for instance, of migrants reaching the shores of Europe these days. This is an iconic picture. I chose to take it in a cartoonized version, and you probably see the point for that. This has been largely abused.